Day 10 of the American Cup saw the rapid grand final match between Irina Krush and Alice Lee, as the two players would battle it out, the 2024 American Cup title on the line. Hello folks, I'm International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and I've been recapping all the action from the 2024 American Cup held here in St. Louis. So after winning the championship final match yesterday against Irina, Alice Lee was able to force the rapid grand final match today, which would consist of 4 rapid games and a blitz playoff if necessary, with the winner of the match taking home the first place prize of $40,000 and of course the title of the 2024 American Cup. It was an absolutely thrilling final match as the players would play 4 rapid games, 15 plus 10. If you'll recall, yesterday Alice Lee was able to defeat Irina in their championship final, but today they would get a fresh start 0-0. So Irina starts off with white in the first game and chooses the English opening. However, the players quickly transpose to a classic Queen's Gambit declined. H6, bishop, H4, and Irina ends up getting a tiny advantage out of the opening in this one. But after C takes D4, knight takes D4, Alice starts having issues here as she's not able to develop the light squared bishop. So knight E5 is played, bishop E2. Now I think bishop D7 here might have been one of the more reasonable moves in the position, just trying to get the bishop out to C6 via bishop C6 or knight C6 next. Instead, we saw knight to D5, trading the dark squared bishops, but after knight takes E7, and very simple but very nice move from Irina here, queen to B3, all of a sudden it's just difficult for black to develop the light squared bishop without hanging the B pawn, and white definitely gets a nagging lead in development. The game continued queen A5, rook D1, knight C6, trade, and knight E4. And although some material has come off, white is much better in this position, as again, all of her pieces are in the game and black still has problems developing the light squared bishop. So queen C7, queen E7, Alice scrambling to get the pieces out, but now queen to B6 and knight C5, Irina starts to go for the kill and looks for a material advantage. And she gets it after rook to D8. It was very difficult for black to defend this position. I think Compy suggests something like knight to D8, which is very difficult to believe in. Rook to D8, though, however, allowed white to take on A6, winning a pawn due to the fact that the knight on C6 is hanging. That's what happens in the game. Takes, queen takes C6, bishop to B7, queen B6, bishop to D5, as Alice starts to look for some counterplay here for the missing pawn. Queen A5, bishop to B3, going after the D file. Irina trades rooks on D8, and now correctly takes the second pawn with queen takes A6. Only 1 minute here left for the players playing on the 10-second increment. Alice goes for rook to D2, but now very nice move, bishop D3, setting up back rank ideas of queen A8 check, as the king on G8 is vulnerable. Alice played this move E4, but now queen A8 check anyway picks up the pawn due to the double attack. King H7, queen takes E4 is played, forcing this endgame where white has multiple extra pawns. Black will be able to win back this B pawn, but after the move A5, this A pawn just becomes way too strong in the position. Rook takes B2 is played, rook A1, just getting behind the passed pawn, and this is completely lost for black. Bishop to C4, now A6. Very precise move. At first glance, it looks like maybe black can take on A6 because of some back rank tricks, but none of that works because white can simply take the rook and the bishop is covering the B1 square. So after A6, F5 was tried by Alice. Irina simply pushes the pawn to A7, and here Alice had to resign the first game as white is going to be promoting very soon. Going to the second game in the match, Alice would then get 2 white games in a row. She starts off with her usual D4, and Irina goes for the Bogo Indian defense, something that she's been playing on and off throughout this event. Bishop D2, A5, A3, takes, and D5. And the players reach a pretty typical structure here after C takes D5, E takes D5, bishop to D3. White gets a tiny structural advantage here, but generally speaking, black is always very solid in these positions. Here, Alice goes knight E2, C5, knight G3, and now C4. Irina pushes ahead. Knight F5, queen drops back, and G6. And actually here, I would say black is already starting to get a bit of an advantage. For example, black could play the move knight to E4 here. Also, knight E4 was available on the previous move. B5, black has ideas of pushing B5, B4. And yeah, already black is starting to feel more comfortable in this one. So b5, knight e5, queen c7, f4. However, Alice doesn't back down, securing the knight on e5. b4 played, takes. And now e4 from Alice. A pretty, I think, practical idea, just trying to open up the position in order to get more tactical opportunities for the pieces. Takes, rook fe1. White is eventually going to be able to win this pawn back. And here Irina goes for this decision, c3. So she gives back a pawn after queen takes c3. Her idea is to play knight to d5, the tempo against the queen and hitting the f-pawn. Alice plays queen to b2, and here Irina makes a very serious mistake with rook a b8. What she should have done was trade on e5, then after something like f takes e5, black can push e3, and this position would still be extremely complicated and very, very double-edged. Here the queen is, of course, defending the bishop on b7. In the game, however, after rook a b8, Alice simply takes the pawn on e4, and now is a pawn up. And black doesn't have any good discoveries against white's queen. And if knight takes f4, well then white has knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and knight f6 check. And white is just winning material. So because of this tactic, white is just staying a pawn up. Irina played bishop a8, but now queen to f2, defending everything and actually bringing the queen closer to the king side. Rook fc8, white trades rooks here, bishop a2, and now f5, Alice goes for the kingside attack. And this one becomes very, very difficult for Irina to defend, who is already in heavy, heavy time trouble here. She tried f6, but now knight to g4, king to g7, unpinning on the diagonal, but this allows knight e takes f6, which opens up the rook against black's queen, and now black's kingside is just falling apart. Queen f7 was played, queen to h4. Alice was pretty ruthless here in this game, although there was a bit more intrigue. After king h8, takes on g6, queen takes g6, bishop to b1, queen to g7. Here, I think the simplest move for white was knight takes h7, where white is just completely winning. Black's king is way too exposed. Black can take the pawn on d4 with check, but then king to h1, and yeah, black's king is not going to survive for long. Instead, Alice played bishop takes h7, which looks just as good, but after knight takes f6, she hesitated here because she realized that she can't take back on f6 immediately in view of queen takes g2 mate. Watch out for that bishop in the very corner. However, she had enough time here to recollect herself. Of course, Irina just captured a piece, but the position was already so overwhelming for white, she's still completely winning after any number of moves. Alice found the most clinical approach from here, bishop f5 check. Now the king can't go to g8 because then knight takes f6 comes with a check, and black doesn't have time to take on g2. So knight h7 was played, but now bishop takes c8, and white is winning all of the material back. Queen takes d4, queen f2, and this was the end of the game. Irina resigned because if she trades queens, then she's just down way too much material. For example, takes, white can take with anything, and then after knight takes c8, there's rook e8 check at the end of the line. For white to remain up and exchange, and then two pawns with a completely winning endgame. So after queen f2, this was resigns, and with this, Alice was able to equalize the score in the rapid match 1-1. Moving on to the third game, Alice would get a second white in a row. This is just how the format works. The high-rated player gets white in the first game and the fourth game. Low-rated player gets white in games 2 and 3. And this game reached a very, very similar structure to what we saw in the previous game. In fact, the opening was the exact same, except I believe the difference here is that in the previous game, Alice played knight e2. Here she plays queen to c2, adjusting her approach a bit as she doesn't let black establish a knight on e4 so comfortably. Irina goes c5, bishop to b5, and we get a pretty typical structure here where black never really wants to take on d4 because then white will take back with a piece. And if black plays c4 at any moment, then they're a bit blockaded because they can't really get the b pawn going as well. h6, both sides kind of calmly improving their position. Knight e2, the knight comes to f4. And here Alice goes for this move, queen to f5, which doesn't quite work out. White didn't really have a ton to do here. You could take on c5, for example, and try something like queen a4, or play queen to b1. In either case, I think the position is very, very close to equal. After queen f5, knight f8, and rook c2, black goes knight e4, bishop d3. White's queen here ends up being a little funny, but her idea is to play queen to e5 and go for the endgame. But after queen takes e5, Alice goes d takes e5, which is fine. It looks a little bit unusual to change the structure in this way, but position remains equal, although already starting to feel somewhat easier for black to play. h4, knight e6, takes, knight h2, and now very nice move, I think, by Irina here, c4, forcing white essentially to take on e4 and go into this endgame with bishop versus knight. Here, Alice had one move to keep the game equal, and that was the move rook to d6, where after takes, e takes d6, this pawn for white is probably going to get taken eventually, but in the meantime, white can hope to generate counterplay, and according to the engine, white is kind of holding their own here, although it's still a very, very complicated game. Instead, we saw rook dc1, but now after b5, white's position here ends up very, very difficult as black is dominating the d file, and white's two rooks are lined up on the c pawn, which is just very solidly defended. So Irina here continues to try and squeeze this into a win, improving the king, bringing the rooks in, pushing e5, and after rook to d2, Alice here had a very, very tough time defending this position, as she basically has to stay put and hope that black doesn't have a way to break through. But Irina keeps the pressure on, maneuvers around, brings the bishop over to h5 and f3, which is very powerful, and then she prepares the pawn break with g5, looking to open the king side and eventually swing the rooks over and attack white from this angle. And that's what ends up happening, h5. Alice just hoping to keep as many lines closed as possible, but of course this is going to be very difficult to accomplish. Takes, rook e1, and both sides here, okay, playing on the increment, they're down to their last 20 seconds here, but the position is just so nice for black, it essentially plays itself. White has no counterplay, and Irina just pushes the h-pawn and starts bringing the rooks over to the h-file. Alice in desperation trades on f3, but now g takes f3, and black's pawns here are just way too strong, and the king side is opening up. Now rook h6, preparing h takes g3, and it's all over. The game ended after takes, rook h1 check. The second rook came in, and now black is winning a rook by force. Rook takes f1 was the end of the game, as after king takes f1, rook takes d2. It's going to be made in a couple moves. So with that game, Irina takes a 2-1 lead going into the fourth game of the rapid match, and she would have white in this game, forcing Alice to win if she would want to get to a blitz playoff. Alice goes for a pretty solid line as she's been playing in the tournament. She goes for this kind of hybrid Rogozin Queen's Gambit decline system that she played against Irina earlier in one of their classical games. And this game ends up starting off very, very solidly. Castles, bishop d3, bishop f5, knight to e2. And it's not clear how exactly Alice is going to play this one for a win. But then all of a sudden, Irina makes a very serious mistake here with the move c4, likely just a blunder. White had a lot of moves, castles, for example, and things are equal. a4 is also fine. After c4, however, the problem is takes, bishop takes, and now queen c6. The very unfortunate double attack. The bishop is hanging, as is the pawn on g2. Irina plays the move knight to g3. This was the best try, but now Alice can grab a pawn with queen takes g2. White can't take the bishop because the rook is hanging on h1. Rook c1 was played, bishop h7, bishop e2, queen d5, but now black is a pawn up and white's king is stuck in the center, making this a very, very difficult position for Irina to defend. She tried bishop f3, queen a5 check, queen to d2. Alice takes on a3. And this one might have been a small opportunity here for white. After bishop takes b7, rook a b8, she absolutely had to play this move, rook takes c7, which looks quite risky because you're using the rook to defend the bishop and black has queen to d6. And it feels like white's coordination is very, very flimsy here. But for better or worse, this is what Irina had to do. Because after she plays the move bishop to c6, now Alice is able to infiltrate with the rook. Very nice move, rook to b2, going after white's queen, also going after white's rook on c1. So queen c3 is played, and now rook to b3, queen back to d2, and now rook d3. And all of a sudden, it turns out that white's queen can't stay in contact with the rook on c1 as it's hanging. Rook on c1 is also hanging, and that's it. White is losing a ton of material here. Irina tried the queen sacrifice, bishop takes d7, but rook takes d2 was played, king takes d2, queen to b2 check, and it's game over. White cannot play rook c2 because of that sniper bishop on h7. So next, white is going to be losing one rook, and of course it's just completely game over here. So after resigning, that would mean we got a 2-2 tie in this 4-game rapid match, with Alice managing to win on demand in this final game and forcing a Blitz playoff. Now, the format for the Blitz playoffs is as follows. The players play 2 games. If there's a winner after 2 games, then that's it. If not, if it's tied 1-1, then they play another set of 2 games and another set and so on. And we've seen some fairly intense and marathon matches in this tournament so far. So Irina got white in the first Blitz game, time control being 3+2. She goes back to the English, but once again transposes into the classic Queen's Gambit declined. This first game was rather solid. Once again, the players get this kind of classical structure where things are very, very even, and both sides have their chances. Here, black gets the 2 bishops right out of the opening, but because the structure is rather closed, white here is of course comfortable, as black's 2 bishops aren't exactly the most active pieces in the world. However, after this nice maneuver, knight c8, knight to d6, Alice definitely gets quite a reasonable position here. Queen to b3, c6 is played, b5, typical break on the queen side. Some pieces come off, and overall this position remains equal for quite some time. However, Irina starts to go a little bit wrong here with the move knight to d2. I think the engine was suggesting a4, for example, followed by a5, trying to trade off this pawn, maybe create a weakness for black on the queen side. After knight d2, queen to d6, g3, slowly black starts taking over here. Bishop to e7, hitting the a-pawn. White goes knight to b1, king to g7, rook e1, a6, setting up b5. And now Irina makes a pretty serious mistake with the move a4, as this pawn ends up being a big target for black. Queen to b4 is played by Alice going into the endgame, where after takes, her rooks are perfectly lined up on the c-file. White is forced to give up the c-file and play this move rook to d1, but now a5, and once again this pawn on a4 is a very serious weakness. Knight d2 played, this ends up being the losing move, bishop to c6, and now white just doesn't have any comfortable ways of defending the a-pawn. If bishop b5, for example, then black can trade, and followed by pushing the a-pawn, rook to c2, and so on, and this a-pawn is just going to be very, very strong. So Irina tries to move rook to c1, which allows black to take on d2. At this point, the players are in pretty heavy time trouble. Her point was rook to c2, bishop to b4, and now bishop to b5, looking to win back the piece. But Alice simply takes on b5, and this forced Irina to resign the first game. As after rook takes c7, bishop takes a4, black has 2 bishops for the rook, along with these 2 connected pass pawns on the queen side, and this is just a hopeless endgame for white. Bishop b3 is next, and the bishops are just going to slowly escort the a-pawn home. White's rook really just can't do anything here. So going into the second Blitz game, Irina would be in a must-win situation here to equalize the match and force another 2-game Blitz playoff. And this time she chooses the King's Indian defense, definitely a very appropriate choice for the moment, aligned with knight bd7, which is quite trendy these days. And quickly the players just get a very, very sharp, very thematic King's Indian position here. f5, takes, and knight to g5. Thematic jump here from Alice going for knight to e6. Irina plays knight df6 here, h3, knight h6. Here the engine was pointing out the immediate g4 as being quite strong for white. Of course, not an easy move to find in a Blitz game. Instead, Alice goes for the much more natural knight e6, takes, and after c6, she now hits Irina with this nice move g4, threatening g5 and also fighting for all of the light squares in the position. This knight e6 move is a very typical idea in these types of positions. Generally, white ends up losing this pawn, but then gets a lot of compensation on the light squares with ideas like queen to b3, putting the bishop on the diagonal, and so on. Here the game continues to be very, very messy. Knight e4 is played. Takes, bishop e3, queen e7, queen c2. Irina does manage to pick up this pawn on e6, and here Alice decides to take on e4. This was probably not great. Something like castles queenside, for example, getting the king to safety, I think would have been a more practical approach. After she takes on e4, Black gets d5 in, and now Black's pawns become very, very strong in the position. Queen to c2 is played. Here Irina pushes e4 to open up the bishop. d4, I believe, would have been even stronger, hitting White's bishop, and then, of course, Black is going to be able to get e4 in anyway, followed by d3, and yeah, it's like disaster absolutely looming here for White. e4 played, allowing Alice to at least get a grip on the d4 square with rook to d1. Knight f7, takes, queen to b3. Finally, White castles here, knight comes to e5, bishop to d4, rook to d7. At this point, the players are both under 20 seconds here, playing on the 2-second increment. So of course, the game gets very, very sharp and extremely messy. Bishop to b5 is played, but this is a huge blunder by Alice, as this allows Irina to go knight f3 check, hitting the bishop on d4. So king g2, knight takes d4. If White were to take the rook on d7, then Black can just simply recapture this one, and she has 2 pieces for the rook in just a completely winning position. Instead, Alice sacrifices the exchange on d4, bishop takes d4, and goes rook to d1. But now she's a full rook down. However, with just 10 seconds on the clock, Irina wasn't able to figure out how to hold on to her material. I think perhaps the simplest would have been the move bishop to g7, just saving the bishop, allowing White to take on d7, and in case of rook takes d5, Black would have this move queen to f7, where the queen is safe, the king is safe, and of course, Black keeps the extra piece and should win this one. But Irina ends up panicking. She plays this move queen to f6, which is a strong move. She gives back her extra rook, but gets queen takes f2 check, forcing king to h1, and now Black is incredibly active here. However, at this moment, Irina misses that White is threatening queen takes d5 check. After either move king to h8 or king to g7 here, Black would be winning because White can't take on d5. This would allow queen to f3 check, where it's White that is actually getting mated here. King h2, queen e2, the rook is hanging, the bishop is about to come in, and this is very, very bad for White. But Irina blunders this. She goes rook to f8, very natural move playing for rook f3 and mate, but this allows queen takes d5 check, and all of a sudden the bishop on d4 is hanging. Now Black didn't necessarily have to lose this game. After rook f7, queen takes d4, queen f3 check. Apparently it still is a draw by perpetual, but with Alice being up a point in the match, this wouldn't really make a huge difference. Alice would still be winning. So Irina instead plays king to h8, but now queen takes d4 comes with check, forcing the queens off the board and leaving White with an extra piece in the endgame. In view of this, Irina resigned the second game, and Alice Lee became the 2024 American Cup champion, winning the first major title of her career. Alice is only 14 years old. Fans will remember that she lost in the finals to Irina in both of the previous years, 2022 and 2023 in this event. But this time she finally comes through and manages to defeat her great rival. So with that, Alice Lee won the 2024 American Cup and took home the first place prize of $40,000. Folks, if you would like to see all of the game standings results from this event, definitely check out uschesschamps.com. You can also find the previous broadcast of each round. All the live coverage is still saved here on YouTube. This has been International Master Kostya Kavutskiy recapping the 2024 American Cup, signing off from St. Louis.